our pleasure as the Northwest Business Club Board of Directors to bring today a speaker who is a Washington native, who has been involved in politics since he was majoring at the University of Washington in political science. At that time, he was thinking he was going to be running for office himself. However, he had a much smarter idea and thought, well, maybe I would rather be involved more with the mechanics of a winning campaign, and so he became interested in running campaigns instead of running his own campaign. He is married with 2 lovely daughters, but he and his wife will be empty nesters by this time next year, and they'll all move out. He has a long list of radio and TV programs that he has broadcast on, and he worked his way through college as a sports writer for the Seattle Times. In addition to these things, he is currently executive director of the Reform Alliance, a nonprofit policy group he founded in 2013 with none other than former Attorney General Rob McKenna. He previously served as campaign manager for McKenna's 2012 gubernatorial campaign and as his chief of staff in the AG office, which leads me to believe that maybe he didn't study as hard as he should have in class. Is that fair? Again, that's just me talking though. And I want to thank Senator Erickson for attending this meeting in his cougar attire. So we kind of have a balance with the University of Washington alum. I don't know about the alum, but at least you got your...
I'm unaffiliated.
You're affiliated. Anyway, let's put our hands together for Randy Pepple.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm nominally aware of the Business Club's activities. It's one that Rob spoke highly of. His interactions with your organization, and as you will find out, or should be aware, I hold his recommendations in pretty high regard. So I thank you for the opportunity to be here. And in fact, when I was first invited when your program director invited me and Riggs and I started considering the opportunity, but didn't know the name of the group, I figured that I was going to have to travel. Because when Riggs told me that the group's mission was promoting fiscally conservative government, I knew that it would not be within walking distance of my home in King County, or even within light rail distance, frankly. And further, I knew I'd be far from home when I suggested as a theme the reality of the new permanent political campaign, that it was readily agreed to. And frankly, I think that's in part because Whatcom County has been ground zero for what the left's new permanent campaign means over the last 18 months. In the amount of money that Senator Erickson referenced was spent in his campaign. I mean, the fact of the matter was, in the last time we ran in 2010, spent about $186,000. You had that being spent on county commission races last year, thanks to California billionaire Tom Steyer and his willingness to fund Seattle organizations that were more than happy to come up to Whatcom County and tell you how to vote. Now, I come before you today to share some information that I have gained over 30 years in political campaigns, and most specifically over the last 5 years when I started getting involved with my old college classmate, Rob McKenna, and trying to determine if we could elect a Republican governor of the state for the first time in a generation. I joke, and unfortunately it's true, that the last time we elected a Republican governor was the first time I voted. And as you can see from my gray hair, I'm not that young. We were unfortunately not successful in that campaign, though the efforts of many people in this room on behalf of Rob's campaign were certainly not the reasons we didn't quite get there. But as part of the post-mortem, if you will, I started accelerating some of the research into why the left is out organizing us in this state, and why the free market and business supporting community has some difficulties in electing folks at the statewide level. I mean, the reality is, with the exception of a person named Gordon or a person named Evans, we have not elected a senator or a governor, with the exception of John Spellman, since 1952. And, you know, and yet, for all of the Democrats' claims that this is a solid Democrat state, it's not true. We have a majority in the state Senate. After 2 years of having a working majority in the state Senate, a conservative majority coalition caucus, we're within 2 seats. We're actually closer to having control in the state house than any time in the last decade, behind by 2 votes. 1 vote right now because there's an empty seat. We are at a 6-4 disadvantage among the 10 members of our congressional delegation, and I don't need to remind you how close we've come several times to having that 5th seat in what's now the 1st congressional, used to be the 2nd congressional. It's a competitive seat. So we're not a hardcore blue state, but we have problems winning in presidential election years when organization is critical. So that leads me to ask and hopefully answer 3 questions that I'm going to put before you today and talk about. The first is, on the permanent campaign, why was it inflicted on Washington State? Why did we get so lucky as to have a permanent campaign in place here well before we saw it in other parts of the country? Secondly, who's driving the agenda? And then finally, what does that mean for business or fiscal conservatives? And as was alluded to in the introduction, I'm an old journalist, and so, you know, looking at the why, the who, the what, generally leads you to a good investigative piece. And so, hopefully, I'll be able to answer those questions and then get to some Q&A at the end. And also in the Q&A, because I know that on your website it mentioned that I'd be here to also talk about wallet-busting policies and regulations, which means you must have read the news that came out of Olympia yesterday from Jay Inslee's budget office that indicates that they are likely to propose $1 billion plus in tax increases next week when he rolls out his budget. And he's going to combine that, because it's not enough to try to take $1 billion more of your tax dollars. He wants to combine that by driving up your energy costs, the cost of heating your home, the cost of driving your cars, cost of operating your businesses, through a disastrous cap and trade policy that they couldn't get through the U.S. Congress, thankfully, which has failed in this state before, and potentially, without going to the legislature, by pushing through something called a low carbon fuel standard or a fuel mandate, which is nothing more than a gas tax scheme that could raise gas prices by $1 a gallon. So I'd be happy to talk about some of those policies as well in the Q&A. I like to remind people what I'm about to talk about isn't rocket science, it's political science. And I was a poli-sci major at the University of Washington. And a lot of the organizational tactics that you see in the permanent campaign that the Democrats utilize are not new. They're actually from Saul Alinsky. And if any of you have ever read Mr. Alinsky, most poli-sci undergraduates had to do so. It's all about the ends justifying the means. And the means are through community organization. And in the 2008 presidential campaign, there were a lot of talk about the fact of how much Mr. Alinsky's work on community organizing had affected and impacted our community organizer-in-chief, Barack Obama. And indeed, if you look at a lot of the stuff that is now proliferated over his 6 years in office, you will see indeed that they come out of those tactics of Mr. Alinsky, which were so remarkably put down in paper in Rules for Radicals, which was published in the 60s. So, before I get into all these questions, though, I did want to put in a shameless plug for the organization that I ran, or excuse me, that I run, that Rob and I founded last year, which is the Reform Alliance. And essentially, we formed the Reform Alliance to provide a vehicle for doing the type of policy research and raising public awareness about issues that we wouldn't be allowed to do necessarily, or we find it much harder to do as private citizens. So we founded the Reform Alliance.
And the reason we need it, frankly, is unlike the left. You know, the business community in the state is conflicted. And Senator Erickson could regale you with the number of business lobbyists who write checks to elect Democrats who work to try to put them out of business. The business community is in the business for business. On the left, their organizations are organized around the principle of bigger government means more for them. And so the reality is we've got a conflicted business community. On the left, they have a solid and very consistent community supporting them. Secondly, our coalition groups lack coordination. You know, we just heard a variety of reports from groups that are in alignment here today. They're not as much in alignment throughout the state in trying to help elect fiscally conservative candidates. I mean, frankly, Tea Party organizations don't always work well hand in hand with Republican Party organizations. Pro-life groups don't spend a lot of time necessarily talking to folks at the Chamber of Commerce. The building industry or realtors or associations like that don't necessarily work with the gun groups. And so our coalition groups don't coordinate their activities near as much as on the left. You know, the environmental activist also belongs to a feminist group, and she's a labor union member.
Yeah.
So she's very well aligned among her coalition groups. And you find that in examples like that throughout the Democratic coalition, because they are committed to bigger government. That's how they get their money. And then finally, the liberals are very good at enforcing unified messaging. I mean, you get 5 Republican office holders in a room and you'll get 6 opinions on something.
Wait, are they Jews?
And on the other side, they use their money people. They use their money people to enforce message discipline. And if you want to get the support of a Tom Steyer, you will sing off of his song sheet. And for that reason, we just don't have the type of those organizations that have helped them build this permanent organization. I'll give you just one example that shows you the links they go to on their willingness to set aside their own policy differences when it means electoral success. In 2012, one of the biggest supporters for JNC was the Washington Conservation Voters, and at the national level, the League of Conservation Voters. They gave him $1 million to the independent expenditure group supporting it. He had to fill out a questionnaire to get that support. Now, at the same time, he was also getting $1 million from the State Labor Council and the union members. And a lot of the private sector union members who have different views on things like Gateway, on jobs versus the environment issue. The conservation voters would never publicly release JNC's questionnaire, what he told them to get that $1 million. And labor agreed to not ask him about it in public. They figured once he got elected, they could fight over their differences on coal ports, but they didn't want it to come up during the course of the campaign. And so JNC was able to skate by without offending the conservation voters and his new best friend, Tom Steyer. So let me go back to that first question. Why Washington? Why were we subjected to this earlier? I'll suggest to you it's because of 3 unconnected events from 2004. In 2004, George W. Bush won re-election despite being massively outspent by the Democratic Party. George Soros, Hollywood liberals, Rob Glazer from here in Washington State, formed groups that put in tons of money into the Democrat National Committee. They couldn't believe that George Bush won election. They don't call it re-election because they don't give him credit for 2000. They could not believe that. And the message that they learned was that they couldn't depend on the party apparatus to do their dirty work. And so in 2005, George Soros formed the Democracy Alliance. The Democracy Alliance is an organization that, according to that well-known bastion of conservative thought, the Washington Post, has spent over $500 billion in the last 9 years supporting Democrat organizations around the country in building up the type of permanent campaign infrastructure that we talk about. Secondly, in this state, Dino Rossi was elected governor twice. And he was only denied the governor's mansion when a King County judge said King County will count votes that had been legally rejected for lack of signature. They changed the rules of the election after the election when they knew they didn't have enough votes. And that ruling was upheld by a state judge who, and I think Senator Erickson probably knows this, but that state judge who made Christine Gregoire the governor just got appointed to the Public Disclosure Commission so he can oversee election law, which is the ultimate irony. But what the Democrats learned from this is that there were too many Democrats that were voting for Dino Rossi. They did not demonize him enough in the course of the 2004 campaign. If you recall, their candidate, three-time elected statewide attorney general, woman candidate, John Kerry was winning Washington State. Patty Murray was getting reelected. There was no way that some unknown former state senator was going to defeat Christine Gregoire, but he did. And the lesson they took from that is never again would they let a Republican candidate try to appeal for Democratic votes. Final thing is the exact opposite happened in Colorado. Now, how many people here have heard of the blueprint? Very good. 'Cause I was going to have a contest later so that I could give away one of the books, because I always carry them with me. I was going to ask you, what was the hedge fund that Tom Steyer ran? Anybody know that one? Except Doug?
Farallon.
Who said that?
Farallon County.
Okay, you'll get the book afterwards. Share it with a friend for Christmas, enlighten somebody else. But what happened in Colorado? 4 billionaires got together with a half dozen liberal activist groups. It was the Conservation Voters, it was the State Education Association, it was the State AFL-CIO, it was the Sierra Club, and it was the Trial Lawyers Association, and Planned Parenthood. Those 6 groups got together with the 4 billionaires and said, if you stop focusing your money on national politics and focus your money on state politics, we can take the state house and the state senate. And this is at a time when Colorado had a 10-point advantage in voter registration for Republicans. The governor was Republican, both senators were Republican, a majority of the members of Congress were Republican, and they had majorities in both houses. And in 2004, they flipped that, took control of the state house and state senate for Democrats in a year when George Bush was winning their state. And they did it by following the blueprint. The only reason we know about the blueprint is because one of their genius staff members left it on a copy machine at Kinko's in 2007. And the person who found it on the copy machine at Kinko's gave it to a talk radio host in Denver. And that talk radio host, after talking about it on the air, gave it to Fred Barnes at the Weekly Standard, and he wrote about it in the summer of 2008. The book was then written by a journalist and a former Republican legislator in 2009, published in 2010. That's how we know what happened here. But Democrats knew what had happened there because the people who were the architects of the blueprint in Colorado started going around and trying to replicate it in other states. One of the first states that came to was Washington. That's mentioned, I think, in page 175 of the book, about how they came up here and formed the Progress Alliance of Washington. So, what is the blueprint? I mean, what does it say to you? It says, 1, you keep your funding in the shadows. It was the so-called Gang of 4 that provided the funding in Colorado. And the Gang of 4, their biggest issue for 2 of the 4 billionaires was gay rights. One was stopping an English as a second language proposal, or English as first language proposal in Colorado, rather. And the 4th one was concerned about higher ed. Those weren't the burning issues in Colorado, but they got together with the interest groups that I mentioned earlier to target a half dozen state, Senate, and House races across the state that they thought they could flip, but not if the voters knew where the money was coming from. So taking advantage of Colorado's campaign finance laws, they kept their money in the shadows. 2, they built non-party capabilities. One of the ways you keep money in the shadows is you don't give it to candidates, you don't give it to party organizations, you give it to 501c4s and groups that don't have to divulge their donors. So that's what they did. And the interest groups ran the negative campaigns. 3rd, attack always. There's nothing positive about the lessons you learn in the blueprint about running campaigns. It's all about so demonizing your opponent that they can't recover, that they can't get back to pick up voters in the middle. And so, with this umbrella theme of Republicans are extreme, they launched a permanent campaign here. Progress Alliance of Washington formed a group of mega donors in this state, including a few billionaires, but mainly just retired tech millionaires, not billionaires. And the first group they funded was Fuse, an online group in 2006. Just to show you how incestuous the left is on this, the woman who runs the Progress Alliance of Washington was at the time married to the guy who ran the Fuse. So they could coordinate fairly effectively then. In 2014, this group, this organization, was finally defined by the mainstream press. It's defined first, you can barely see that chart. That chart I developed and shows my artistic talents and why I'm a poli-sci major. And then it was picked up by public radio. Austin Jenkins, who covers Olympia and is one of the better reporters in the state, was interested in it because his parents lived in Colorado and he'd never figured out how they flipped it. He'd never heard of the blueprint. And so he took an interest in this and went to the building where about 2/3 of these organizations are at in downtown Seattle. You go down to 3rd and University, if you eat at the Wild Ginger there next to the Benaroya Hall. Across the street is a building called the Vance Building. And that is the epicenter for most of these groups. And he outed it. Now, that was after 9 years. They've been in operation since 2005. Now, I'll leave it to you to ask yourself whether a similar conservative organization could have existed in Washington State and never been written about once in the mainstream media in 9 years. And indeed, if you did a search for them, the first time you will see the Progressive Alliance of Washington mentioned in print was when Rob and I launched the Reform Alliance, and they wrote about us then and said we were trying to help them. But that's why they came up here, and here are some of their more notable players, just so that you know what to watch for. And you probably know many of these. Some of them are very active up here. First is Fuse. If you haven't gone to Fuse Washington, it's a very funny website. It's all about engaging their members online. It's about gathering emails, aligning those emails against issue positions, and then giving to campaigns, initiative campaigns and candidates information on how to contact voters who care about their specific issues. So they'll ask a poll question on abortion rights, and then they'll give the results of that to Planned Parenthood. They'll ask an issue on the environment, and they'll give that to the Sierra Club or the Conservation Voters. And they're really a database management tool and a mechanism for aligning their messaging. The Environmental Priorities Coalition takes that to the nth degree then in lobbying the legislature. It's a coalition of about 40 groups across the state that are environmental organizations. One of the ones that I've always wondered about, because they get public money, is the League of Women Voters. And why it is that they are a member of the Environmental Priorities Coalition. So it's a good question for somebody. But they use that to drive their messaging around 2 or 3 environmental initiatives a year, and they focus on those in the legislature. You have the Stand, And I get this delivered to my email box every day. That's the Washington State Labor Council's daily newsletter of what's going on that they want labor members to be aware of. And they use a lot of derogatory pictures of Republican elected officials. I see that Senator Erickson's laughing. They use a couple of him. They use Boeing. Anybody that they want to demonize, they do a little artwork on photos and put it up there. They're very, very intelligent. But that's how they organize their members around specific issues. Let's put that out every day. The Northwest Progressive Institute started as an attack organization against Tim Eyman and his initiatives, and has since become a repository for organizing their grassroots folks, providing clips, providing events, doing training, and so on. Next is Sightline. Now, some of you may be familiar with Sightline. They're very active up here because one of their reporters, Eric LaPlace, has been one of the leaders in the fight against Gateway. And they have gotten a fair amount of money out of the Progress Alliance and out of some of the environmental groups to be at the forefront of pushing out information, anything they can against coal, anything they can against oil, anything they can against carbon, and extolling all the virtues of everything that's good and wonderful about their preferred energy choices, which almost always involve more government control. Public Cola is an urban outlet. It mainly caters to the downtown Seattle crowd. A lot of stuff about abortion in there, a lot of stuff about the environment. They write a lot about land use. You start a lot of arguments in Seattle, but it's just a publication to kind of give an urban issue focus. And if you look at Olympia, the members from Seattle so dominate the caucus down there. This is really the reading material for the Frank Chops of the world. Next is Crosscut. Crosscut is not as campaign-oriented as the other sites, except for their Olympia reporter, a guy who is so far left that he'd be very comfortable at the Stranger. But the rest of it, this is really for the intelligentsia in Seattle. This is for the establishment liberals, the folks who used to read the Weekly, but now don't read alternative publications anymore. Instead, they read Crosscut. But for the alternative weekly publications, they now read the Stranger instead of the Weekly. And the Stranger can be counted on to attack Republicans at all costs and to promote whatever is the leftist idea du jour, whether it's the $15 minimum wage, whether it's a carbon tax, what have you, through both their print publication and their online publication, The Slog. And then the former top writer for The Stranger was a guy named David Goldstein. David got fired, which it's hard to be too far to the left for The Stranger, but evidently he was. So he went back to being a blogger for his blog. We call it HA. It's Horse's Ass. He first made his name. He first made his name, if you will, by trying to get an initiative on the ballot to have Tim Eyman declared a horse's ass. It was one of the few times that the court said, "No, we don't think that really works." But he named his blog after that. And this guy puts out such vitriol, profane for the most part, solely with the intent of trying to get it picked up by the mainstream media. David Goldstein is his name. And now that he's been fired by The Stranger so that he can have a job, he's now a speechwriter for Nick Hanauer. And if you don't recognize it, Nick is the man behind the $15 minimum wage movement. He was the first non-family member allowed to invest in a little company called Amazon. And so he made a lot of money off that, then made a lot of money off F5 and a couple other investments, and so now he thinks he's the smartest guy in the room. And he's got David Goldstein writing his speeches. I don't know how smart that is. But this is just a vehicle for trying to plant stories that otherwise would not be picked up by the mainstream media and get them a citation. For instance, in the 2012 campaign against Rob, they had an independent expenditure organization that ran ads attacking Rob for a wide variety of things. Over 60% of the claims that were made in their ad came from one article written by David Goldstein called "Why Rob McKenna Hates Your Children." And it was all about opposing Obamacare. And he just threw everything against the wall in that article, and that's what they would cite in the TV ads against Rob, the radio ads against Rob. And then it would get picked up by the Times or the PI or the Olympian, some other mainstream press, so that they could then cite those articles. But over 60% of them came from one article. So this is how it all fits together. And again, if you look at the blueprint, it talks about the 7 capacities for a permanent campaign. And these are their 7 capacities. I already talked about Fuse, because one of the capacities is impacting online media. I've also talked about sideline publicola, the stranger, because engaging the media is one of the other capacities. The progressive majority is their training arm. It's run by labor. Investigations, you need the ability for strategic investigations and litigation. That's done by a guy named Noel Lowney, who files frivolous lawsuits against whoever the leading Republican is, gets headlines out of them, and then the lawsuits go nowhere. Did it against Dino Rossi 3 times, did it against Rob twice. The Win-Win Network is their mobilization arm for social justice and minority populations. Washington Bus is their mobilization arm for getting out the youth vote. The Washington State Budget and Policy Center was formed so that they could have an intellectual foundation, such as it is, for their ideas. And then EOI is Economic Opportunity Institute. That puts out the white papers and so forth so that the elected Democrats can point to a specific item as backing up their claim. It's all funded out of the Progress Alliance in the middle. Progress Alliance doesn't publish their names. They're donors. Rob Glazer, the founder of Progressive Networks, or changed the name to Real Networks after a few years. Is one of them. Nick Hanauer is one of them. Eric Liu is one of them. Dennis Hayes, who's in charge of the Bullet Foundation, is one of them. In more recent years, SEIU, WEA, the Washington Conservation Voters have all joined. And most recently, Tom Stair joined last year, in fact, runs his local operation out of the Progress Alliance offices there on 3rd Avenue. So, why am I telling you all this? As I said, the Reform Alliance, we're formed to try to make a real difference. We took the first 2 letters off Reform and off of Alliance, we call it Real. And it's about building awareness by making people aware of what's going on in this regard, and then helping create and fund communications abilities. We've got to be out there communicating on a daily basis. Because the fact of the matter is, it's 400,000 people that we have to impact. That's 10% of the state's registered voter population. There's a policy partisan disconnect in this state. The Democrats have done such a good job, sometimes with the help of our own people, at demonizing the Republican brand, that there are 400,000 people. If you assume everybody who voted for Rob McKenna also voted for the 2/3 initiative on raising taxes that Senator Erickson is going to bring up in the legislature, kind of try to get around the Supreme Court decision against it. That still means that there were 400,000 people that voted for that initiative to make it harder to raise taxes and voted for a candidate for governor who said that was an unconstitutional initiative. In fact, it was one of the very few specific positions Jay Inslee took during the 2012 campaign. I mean, I challenge you to try to think back to something specific he said. One of them was that 1188, the 2/3 initiative, was unconstitutional. And 400,000 people voted for him even though they wanted that initiative to pass. And that's the policy disconnect. People who support Republicans and fiscal conservatives on issues, but really don't like to vote for them if they have an R after their name. So what have we done? One, we've just worked on funding organizations like SHIFT, which try to bring the focus to Inslee's tax scheme, his $1.17 a gallon gas tax scheme. Allows you a little calculator so you can figure out what it would cost you. It's tried to point out his views on transportation. And then there's Smarter Government Washington, a second website that Rob writes on, that the editor of that publication is a good Whatcom County boy, Adam Faber, sitting in the back. They know him here.
Thanks, Charlie.
And that tries to point out the differences between the SHIFT, which points out what you get when you vote for Democrats, and Smarter Government, which what type of policies you get if you vote for fiscal conservatives, to try to break that down for people. And here's why. and I'll leave you with this. This is one of the key donors to and founders of the Progress Alliance, a guy named Paul Moritz. He was one of those early Microsoft guys he wrote a little program called Windows. Made a ton of money. Sold it. Founded a little company called Pi. Sold it. Made a ton of money. And now gives it to liberals to try to make Washington as economically uncompetitive as possible. But this is what he said in a brochure for the Progress Alliance that I found in 2007 that I was not supposed to find. Many of the problems we face can only be dealt with through long-term systemic changes in society. The Alliance offers a way to pool resources, interact with a thoughtful group, and learn in order to help bring change. Now, frankly, you can say the same about you guys, about this organization. But the fact is, the folks running the Progress Alliance think they know better, and they have the millions of dollars to bring to bear to try to convince a small sliver of the electorate, that 400,000 I pointed out to you. Frankly, that's not even what we need to win. If 48,000 people had voted a different way in 2012, we'd be having a much different conversation right now. And I could guarantee you that a governor like Rob McKenna would not be proposing $1 billion tax increase next week. But that's who we have to impact, and that's what the other side's been doing. That's why you have the permanent campaign here in Whatcom County and across our state. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. Hearing none, I'm done. Oh, yes, sir.
Well, you know, I think that Republicans in this state have proven the old quote of nice guys come in last. And one thing that we did up here in Whatcom County was we did fight fire with fire. You know, with everything they came out against Doug with, that touch of the sunglasses really worked real well. And when are we going to start fighting fire with fire in the state on statewide races, like what we did here? I know it takes money, and we had it here, and I think we also have had it in the past, and statewide, and we didn't really go after the other guys.
Well, I certainly, I agree with you that the Alinsky tactics of the ends justify the means can help guide a certain amount of campaign spending. And in this state, I mean, I would suggest that if you look at the money that the BIAW spent in 2008 and 2010 supporting Dino Rossi in ads against Gregoire and Patty Murray, that those were not shrinking violet ads. And in 2012, on Rob's behalf, the ads that were run by the Republican Governors Association in this state very much focused on Jay Inslee. The problem is this, that what Republicans have had over the last decade is whatever's the candidate under attack puts together the response, and there's no ongoing 24/7 permanent activity that's going after the other side every day. It's what I'm out talking to people about. I think you're seeing it come about. I think people like Tom Steyer, hell, he was actually the best fundraiser for Doug and for Andy Hill in the district where I live. I mean, Andy Hill's fundraising went over $1 million just into the campaign, in large measure because of Tom Steyer getting involved and the people in the district getting angry about it. So I think you're seeing some movement in that direction, but Republicans don't always join together to get involved in that manner. It isn't always in our nature. Yes, sir.
Dave, two questions. John Kirk, Scott Walker in Wisconsin, and in the front of the blueprint, it talks about 4 states that the blueprint people were targeting, but Wisconsin blew up in their face. And it seems that the unions were the catalyst in that whole thing. Wisconsin had matured and was ripe for the picking against the union thing. Well, so what can we do against unions here in Washington State?
Well, I think it's you've got a flyer on your table from the Freedom Foundation.
Yes.
Their newsletter. And Tom McCabe, who used to be at the Building Industry Association of Washington, now at the Freedom Foundation, they've made it their mission to challenge the control of unions in the state. And they're going after them at a city by city level. And I think that on SHIFT, we've done a fairly good job of pointing out the union impact on state policies. I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether Jay Inslee is able to jam through the state legislature $580 million worth of raises for pay raises for state employees. At the same time, he says that we need $1 billion in new taxes. His Office of Financial Management just said last week, yes, it is financially feasible for him to give those pay raises that he negotiated with the unions who gave him $1 million in 2012. And that's a pretty good return on investment, by the way. It'll be interesting to see where the legislature goes along and ratifies those employment agreements. Or whether they say, no, that is not within it. And frankly, we need some of those funds. I mean, I think that the opportunity to, you're seeing some states that are going to go after right-to-work legislation in their upcoming legislative sessions because they elected Republican legislatures. We aren't there yet. We don't have the House. We're closer to the House than we've ever been. We've got the Senate. But I don't know that we have 25 votes in the Senate for right-to-work. But those are the types of, what's that?
I said paycheck protection. So.
Yes. But there are some ways to start defining for the public what the union control of state government has meant. I mean, frankly, the reason that we're under a court order to fund public education is because the Democrat majorities for the last 30 years have put public schools fifth. They put them behind public employees. They put them behind the environment. They put them behind the trial lawyers, and they put them behind their social services. Then they get to the schools. I mean, they operate under the old line that was attributed to an AFT union leader who says, I'll start representing the kids when they start paying dues.
Whoa.
Yes, sir.
I think I know the answer to this question, but you can't get a message out if you don't have a balanced media, and we certainly don't in this state, and certainly not nationwide. If it weren't for talk radio, we wouldn't be able to get even a partial message out, and only really bright people listen to talk radio. So, I'm wondering why more conservatives who've done very well in life, made a lot of money, why aren't they buying media outlets and using that as a vehicle to inform the public and maybe drive public opinion?
Well, I guess one of the things is they like to make money, and media outlets aren't right now, particularly newspapers. I mean, I just showed you about a dozen websites. And that is how public opinion is getting shaped nowadays. People are not getting their news. The folks that are the persuadables, that 400,000, that last 10% of the electorate that defines close elections, they get their news through word of mouth, through talking to their neighbors, their friends, their co-workers, the person in the car with them, or they get it online. They select their news outlets. I mean, there used to be 2 houses filled with reporters covering the legislature in Olympia, the White House and the Blue House. Every major newspaper in this state, and even some of the minor ones, had somebody who covered the legislature full time. The TV stations from Seattle had a bureau in Olympia. There's not a single TV bureau left in Olympia, and I think there's 6 writers left full time in the White House. I mean, there isn't media covering politics. You say, I used to be up front on King 5, and I was on KCD Connects with Enrique Cerna. Those were the last 2 public affairs shows that covered politics in this state for TV. Both went away. So I guess I would say we can get the message out through talk radio, through websites, through groups like this. And we're far less dependent than we would need to be on network TV, network radio, and large media, because we're never going to get them. I mean, I worked my way through school in the Seattle Times. I've been in newsrooms for the last 30 years of TV, radio, and newspapers. And I'm often the only Republican in the room. And that's not going to change. So, Doug, you had a question?
Yeah. Go ahead, Doug. So, last couple elections,
It was that bright red sweater.
The
lobbyists give that to you?
Man! Good golly, yes. But So last couple election cycles, going back, when we were 17 members of the Senate, we picked up, we're 25 Republicans now. Jan Angel won a race, running pretty conservative, I think, effort at her race down in Kitsap County, maybe better. This last cycle, all the target races, whether you're in Spokane with Baumgartner, Steve O'Ban, Jan Angel again, myself, and even Andy Hill on the east side of Lake Washington over in Kirkland, all of us ran what I would call pretty conservative campaigns. Even Andy Hill was featured in all his flyers saying no new taxes, balance the budget, don't need to. On the carbon issues, he was also not on the believer side, so he was tainted by that. But still, it seems to me that so many Republicans out of King County are scared to embrace a conservative message and say, let's do the 2/3, let's take on the labor. Where is that? What is the hesitancy among kind of that? Some people would call them the establishment Republicans, some would call them our funder class, who are kind of, I think, not scared of and hesitant to say we go all in on some of these conservative viewpoints to try and drive home, and the popular ones in particular, like the 2/3, which is so popular, when we get pushback when we try to advance that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the fiscal issues, you rarely have too much disagreement. I mean, again, I think on our funder class, which is a big part of the challenge, the people who fund the campaigns, the people who will write a $50,000 check to the party, or a $100,000 check to the party, they tend to be businessmen and women, and they tend to want to see return on their investment, and for too long, we haven't shown them that return. At the state level, we have not. Now, so then it's chicken and egg. Well, do you get the funding first and then you win, or do you win and then you get the funding? So I think that's part of the problem. Social issues have been a challenge for our funder class. And it was in the mid-90s, I worked for Rick White. Got elected to Congress in the Republican Revolution year of 94. Got unelected in 98 when we lost to Jay Inslee. Thanks to a third-party Republican candidate who got in and cost us 5% of the vote, because he said there was no difference between Rick White and Jay Inslee. And, so that has caused problems with our folks. And we had some of our funders at that time mad at Rick because he voted for the assault weapon ban, or voted against the assault weapon ban. And their wives were screaming at them when they came home. They said, I can't get involved in these races if you guys are going to go off on these tangents on social issues. Now, the fact of the matter is, the majority of the Republicans in this state don't have a big problem with that, particularly on gun issues and on life issues as well. But you do in your funder class, you've got some challenges, particularly on the social issues, and that's how the Democrats have defined Republicans as extreme. And unfortunately, we have members in our own party who then say, well, I'm mainstream, not extreme, and they play right into the Democrats' hands. And I've had that conversation with Sam Reed and said, change the name of your organization. All you do is help the Democrats. But I think we're making some changes there. I think success is key. And, Andy Hill was in that race. My wife worked in the campaign. My daughter was in one of his commercials. I think he ran a prototypical center-right campaign and stayed focused on the fiscal issues predominantly. Democrats kept trying to drag him back into fights about abortion and fights about the environment, because that was the only way they're going to win. Yes, ma'am?
So do I hear you saying that in order to turn the tide of the state, we have to state that they have social issues and
No, I'm just saying that's part of the challenge that every candidate will face. I think you just tell them, here's what I believe, here's how I'm going to win. What we have to do from our grassroots side is, I do go back to, the 11th commandment. I mean, I don't attack other Republicans. I talk about my ideas. And when we've got people, part of the reason why Rob lost in 2012 was we lost about 1% of the vote in Eastern Washington that stayed home. Now, we lost by 3 points, so 1% didn't mean the race, and I don't blame people for that. But they thought Rob wasn't conservative enough. Well, they're nuts. So I'm not saying don't bring up social issues. I'm saying state what your position is and then talk about what's most important to you. If social issues are the most important thing in your campaign, you can talk about them. You can win in Eastern Washington with it. You might win up here. Might win in parts of eastern Snohomish County. You will get killed in King County. You'll lose in parts of Pierce County. But I think you can be very conservative and say, hey, I believe in life. Rob did. said I'm a Catholic. I don't believe in gay marriage. My faith, I don't, I would advise a woman to have an adoption, not an abortion. And he got pilloried for that. And yet that still wasn't conservative enough for some of the folks in our own party. And, those are their principles. But I'm just saying from the standpoint of our messaging, I think we talk about what unites us and what defines us differently than the Democrats, particularly on the issues that people care about. And right now, frankly, jobs is the biggest one. Jay Inslee has shown no interest whatsoever in growing jobs in this state. And we should point that out every day. Yes, sir.
So you and me, most of us here are not part of the Generation X or the millennial generation. What are you guys doing that's giving you connections with those two groups, with real?
Well, one, we're online, which is where most of them get their information. We try to use more graphics. We try to use more video. We try to target on issues that will matter to them. Frankly, I think we're seeing a movement among young people that is not dissimilar to what happened in the late 70s and early 80s when I was a young person in high school and in college in the Reagan years, where their dissatisfaction with government is just something we need to continue to point out. Because government is not serving them well. I mean, the folks in the 18 to 25 category, Democrat candidates lost by about 9 points among that group over what Obama had. So I think you just talk to them about what does your future look like and what type of organization or what type of government do you want? One that lets you make choices on how to spend your money, or one that tells you what type of fuel you will put in your car and what kind of car you will drive and how far you will drive it?
Last question. Roger's been trying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Last question.
I want to go back to what Randy brought up, he's gone now, about the media and what you said about the media. We all know that people aren't reading the newspapers much anymore. I look at it online. But I think we conservatives are missing a good bet by not doing more with humor at all levels, all kinds of media. We look at the success of Fox News, for instance. They could be doing a conservative Saturday Night Live, and I frankly wonder why aren't they doing it? And
They call it their regular show.
it's a target-rich environment. When you look at all the stupid things that the golfer-in-chief and his flunkies and Inslee say and do all the time, Lois Lerner, on and on, there's all kinds of targets out there, but we're doing hardly anything on that.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, it is, to me, it's a little more scary than illustrative that people under the age of 25 look more for their news to Jon Stewart and Colbert. I mean, fake news is where they get their news. I wish our people were funnier as well. I try to be funny. We do on Shift. We do our Friday funnies. We have a little Twitter account called Insleeisms, where we point out some of the really dumb things he says. Because when he goes off script, man, it is Saturday Night Live material. But we're not as we don't have the same humor bone, I guess. But that is one of the ways for reaching out to young people, is the question I was asked here. That is one of the ways that you do it. So we try to have fun with it. We try to do a lot with graphics and pictures, and that is the way. Whether we're missing the boat by not having a conservative comedy show, I mean, I think that would be intriguing because you're right, the material is there, and it seems like there's enough space in comedy for that. But Dennis Miller didn't make it when he tried to have his show, and Dennis is a pretty funny guy, fairly conservative guy, but it didn't quite catch on, so I guess we'll have to wait for the next one. Again, thank you very much for your invitation today.